Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leslie Crawford. I'm the Deputy Director of the FDIC Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. And I want to thank you all for attending our Diversity in Education Series event in observance of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I extend greetings to our employees in the regional, area, and field offices that are viewing the program via FDIC TV and VTC, or listening by way of audio conferencing. Thank you all for taking time from your busy schedule to participate in today's program. I also want to welcome and thank our featured speaker, Dr. Nicholas Hartlep, for accepting our invitation to be here today. This year marks the 145th anniversary of the completion of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad. And last week, the Chinese immigrants who worked on that railroad were honored by being registered in the U.S. Department of Labor's Hall of Honor in Washington, D.C. The more than 12,000 Chinese laborers who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad are the first Asian Americans to be inducted into the hall since its creation in 1988. During the ceremony, Labor Department Deputy Secretary Chris Liu indicated that by sharing the story of the Chinese immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, we are reminded that the United States has benefited from wave after wave of industrious immigrants. And so, in that spirit, the FDIC pays tribute to the generations of Asian, American, and Pacific Islanders who have enriched our history and will continue to be instrumental in this country's future successes. Thank you. I will now turn the program over to Martin Henning, FDIC's Acting Chief Information Officer, who will make opening remarks and introduce our speaker.
All right. Can you all hear me all right? Yes. Very good. Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Very good. It's an honor to be here today and to make opening remarks in recognition of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month and to introduce our featured speaker. I'm Martin Henning. I'm the Acting Chief Information Officer at the FDIC. Asian Pacific American Heritage Month has been officially celebrated in the U.S. for more than a quarter of a century. This observance is a celebration of the cultures, traditions, and histories of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States. During this month, we recognize the millions of Americans represented in this group whose love of family, community, and hard work has helped to unite us as a people and sustain us as a nation. This observance originated in a congressional bill when, in 1978, Congress passed a joint congressional resolution to commemorate Asian American Heritage Week during the first week of May. The month of May was chosen to coincide with two important milestones in Asian American history: the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants in the U.S. on May 7, 1843, and Leslie's already referred to this, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad by mostly Chinese workers on May 10, 1869. In 1990, Congress voted to expand this observance from a week to a month-long celebration, and in May 1992, the month of May was permanently designated as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So this year's theme, Diverse Leadership plus Expanding Opportunity, an Imperative for America, was chosen by the Federal Asian Pacific American Council to reflect the critical role of diversity leadership in the multicultural mosaic in America, and to honor the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The Federal Asian Pacific American Council suggests that it is imperative for America to take the lead in its pivot to Asia and the Pacific, and believes that the potential for continuous innovation and success is guaranteed by the inflow of immigrants from every country. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have made and continue to make an indelible mark on our national landscape, providing labor for important national infrastructure such as the Transcontinental Railroad, creating jobs through free enterprise, and supplying leadership at all levels in business, government, and both the public and the private sectors. From pioneers like Judge Herbert Choi, the first Asian American appointed to the federal bench, to Emil Kang, the youngest and first Asian American to hold the top administrative post of a major symphony orchestra, to Cristita Comerford, the first person of Filipino descent to be selected as the White House executive chef. Don't know if you knew that. I didn't know that. To Danny Angais, the only native Hawaiian to compete at the Indianapolis 500, which we just saw run again, and Betty Nguyen, the first Vietnamese American to anchor a national television broadcast in the United States. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have immersed themselves in every aspect of American life. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are a diverse community with distinctive languages, religions, cultures, histories, and pathways to the United States. They represent one of the fastest growing populations in America, and according to the U.S. Census data, single-race Asian Americans grew faster than any other race group in the U.S. from 2000 to 2010, increasing by 43%, another statistic that surprised me. Moreover, during the same period, single-race Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders increased by 35.4%. Based on those statistics, the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community is expected to expand their investments in the economic future and prosperity of this country, as well as contribute to the national character that all Americans revere. In closing, I'm proud to have had the opportunity to join the FDIC in paying tribute to Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and to reflect on the many contributions they have made and continue to make toward the development of this country. Their courage and strong will to succeed in even the most difficult circumstances sets them apart and epitomizes the spirit, character, strength, and resilience that we should all strive to emulate. It is now my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's program, Dr. Nicholas Hartlep. Dr. Hartlep is currently an assistant professor of educational foundations at Illinois State University. And prior to that, he was an Advanced Opportunity Program Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, an Urban 13 university, where he earned a PhD in the social foundations of urban education and was named an outstanding doctoral student. Dr. Hartlep is a former public school teacher who has taught in Rochester, Minnesota, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and abroad in Quito, Ecuador. He has also written several scholarly books, including The Model Minority Stereotype, Demystifying Asian American Success. Ladies and gentlemen, now please join me in giving Dr. Hartlep a warm FDIC welcome.
Can you hear me? All right, wonderful. Thank you, Leslie, for that great introduction, as well as Martin. I want to thank the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion for allowing me to come share some thoughts with you today. And before I begin, I guess I'd like to be honest with you. I was really nervous coming here, not because I had to talk in front of a lot of people, because professors love to talk a lot. But the fear was, can I pack it in 30 minutes? And so I'll do my best to honor everyone's time. Another thing is, I always like to start warming up a crowd. So just thinking out loud with you, I'm thinking of the passing of Maya Angelou, and thinking about my own academic upbringing. I've had a lot of strong black women as mentors, and so Maya Angelou was definitely one of those mentors in reading her scholarly work. Another person, just thinking out loud, that we definitely need to think about is Norman Mineta, who essentially started much of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about for this month, but then also, beginning in the 70s. And just so you know, I wasn't even born then. So I'm a young professor, but at the same time, acknowledging that much of the work that needs to be done is actually work that was already begun before we even were born, or perhaps even came to do this work. So. Okay, I'd like to start by saying that those who tell the stories also hold the power. This is something Plato once wrote. And so I'm going to tell you all a story today. It might be a story you've heard before. It might be a new story. Hopefully it's not a boring story. But nonetheless, it's a story. As has already been said, the AAPI population is the fastest growing ethnic and racial population. It comprises many different groups, subcategories: Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and it's very heterogeneous. You can see the growth from 2000 to 2010, but then also from 2010 to 2013, and in the last 3 or 4 years, right, it's this snowball, and it continues to grow. And why is this important? Well, it's important for many reasons, but it's important for representation. So thinking about today's topic, right, of leadership and opportunity and imperative for America, I think that we need to recognize, right, that the AAPI population represents foreign-born. I was foreign-born. I was born in Korea, and I came to the United States. I was adopted when I was 2 years old. But also that they're impacted, the AAPI population is impacted by a broken immigration system. And so when we think about immigration issues, oftentimes we think of the border and we think of Mexico. But as you soon will see in the next slide, Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders represent a large population within the undocumented population. So here you have information on from 2000 to 2011. The growth of certain subcategories of Asian Pacific Islanders. And you see that from 2000 to 2011, sizable growth in the number and percentage, especially India, right? 120 to doubled, essentially, right? And that about 1 in every 8 Asian immigrants was undocumented, totaling 1.3 million, and that was in 2011. Okay, let's go back to Norman Mineta for a moment. In 1994, he was responsible for finding the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And CAPAC, or CAPAC, is responsible for this infographic that you see. And what you see is a lot of problems. You see that, for instance, in the Southeast Asian American community, 35 to 40% of Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian populations do not finish high school. You see that AAPIs account for over 50% of chronic hepatitis B infections in the United States. You see when the housing crisis occurred that AAPIs experience a large percentage of that foreclosure, the large percentage of foreclosures. And see, so you see that all Asians or Asian Pacific Islanders they're not all successful. And so today's story is not a story of let's point out all of the wrong things that are occurring, but it's to tell a story that's different perhaps than you've been told, and to talk about opportunities and work that can be done. And so I want to use a metaphor. And the metaphor I'm going to share with you is that the model minority stereotype of AAPIs is like a bikini. And that was stolen. This metaphor that I'm using is stolen. There was a business professor who used this same metaphor, and he said statistics are like bikinis. So what do I mean by that? What the myth reveals is suggestive, but what it conceals is vital. Again, what do I mean? Well, you can see, I want to thank my Japanese-American friend, Tak, who he's a comic artist. He created this for me because I said, Tak, I'm going to FDIC, I need a bikini, and then he's like, what exactly? I'm telling you, make me a graphic, and this is what he came up with. And so I thought he did a wonderful job. But so Tak, if you're watching, they're applauding for you. But you see the red, that's the bikini, right? And it suggests, right, that Asians are obedient, they're disciplined, perhaps that bikini might be Harvard educated, what have you. Very good. The bikini looks good. But underneath that bikini, what it conceals is suicide, frustration, glass ceiling, things that in many regard are invisible. And so this is part of the story that really, it's hard to understand what I'm saying, but the growth of Asian Americans really hasn't meant much for them because they remain invisible. Now that really seems odd, doesn't it? That a group that continues to grow in size remains invisible. I'm not sure if it was Leslie or Martin who said it, talking about some of the accomplishments of some Asians. One accomplishment or new thing we could add to is ABC. ABC is now going to run the first Asian American sitcom, fresh off the boat. Raise your hand if you've heard about that. It's in the fall, I think it's starting up, fresh off the boat. And so, right, that will give the Asian American community some more visibility. Ultimately, right, that visibility could be good or bad. It could really re-entrench misunderstandings. Okay. I want to talk to you about 3 areas, and I just picked them out because I think, reading literature and doing research and being Asian American myself, that there are areas of need. One is business leadership, right? Second is educational leadership. And third is political leadership, right? Let's talk about business leadership for a moment. According to this report by LEAP, and LEAP stands for Leadership, Education, Asian Pacifics. So it's a group that's really concerned about leadership for Asians and Asian Americans. According to this report, Asian Pacific Islanders, they continue to be underrepresented in leadership positions despite their incredible growth rates, right? Now this is all despite the fact that between 2000 and 2010, 46% growth, right? The fastest growing, but still underrepresented, right? Now, I ask the question, could it be that the model minority stereotype suggests that Asian Pacific Americans are model minorities, meaning that they are, they're technicians. They're good at math. They can do database entry, but they don't have the charisma. They can't handle a board meeting. They don't have the soft skills. Is that contributing to the limited number of Asians in the business sector? I don't know. Is it a glass ceiling or is it a sticky floor? Right? Second report, conducted by a Center of Work-Life Policy. 25% of Asians feel that they face workplace discrimination because of their ethnicity, while only 8% of African Americans, 9% of Hispanics, and 4% of whites. Fewer than half of Asians have a mentor in their professional life, making them 15% less likely to have a mentor than their white colleagues. Mentorship is super important. I said initially, many of my mentors were black women. They were strong black women. Maya Angelou, my doctoral advisor, Tandika Chapman. The list goes on. I did not have mentors that were Asian Americans because they weren't there, right? They just weren't there. So mentorship is a need for the Asian Pacific Islander community in the business sector, certainly. Now, it's interesting. I just did some research and I looked at professors in colleges of education in the United States. And my grad assistants and we looked at as many colleges, and we looked at, we used the U.S. World and News Report rankings of graduate schools from the top to the bottom, right? And we looked at all their websites, and we entered their names, their races, their genders, when they got their PhD, where they got their PhD, etc., all trying to find endowed professors. If you don't know what an endowed professor it is, I'm an assistant professor, then there's associate professor, then there's full professor, then there are distinguished professors and endowed professor. If you have an endowed professor, it means you are a world-renowned scholar, right? And you have a lot of acclaim and a lot of power, etc. According to our analysis, there were only 8 AAPIs, right? Only 8. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the names and the locations and when they were awarded, all of these 8 were awarded in the 2000s. To me, I think that's telling, because I do see Asian Pacific Islanders making headway and making progress in so many fronts. And I hope to see more Asian American endowed professors. However, when we looked at the data, most were white men who were endowed, right? That there was an advantage. If you were a male, males, there's a higher rate. Now, one person might say, well, Dr. Hartlep, that makes sense because there's a limited amount of K-12 teachers in America who are Asian. And to be a professor of education, you have to have been formerly a teacher. And then it's a pipeline issue, right? Well, there is a need for more K-12 teachers. By a show of hands, think about your own K-12 experience. Any one of you have, from kindergarten to 12th grade, an Asian American teacher? Okay. Wonderful. And then if your hand's not up, you didn't. Right now, according to research, 1% are K-12 are API. And according to another scholar, the rate's even lower. And you see this actually going on now. Anyone here of the organization Teach for America? Teach for America right now is starting a program attempting to get more Asian APIs to become teachers. So you do see that there is this understanding that there's a need there. Political leadership. Now, the Committee of 100, they did a survey. They did a survey in 2001 and in 2009. And this is what they found that's relevant for today's discussion. In 2001, they found that 23% of the general population said they would feel uncomfortable voting for an Asian American as president of the United States. There goes my dream. Well, I'm not naturally born, so I can never become president. But maybe if I could, maybe they change the rules, then I could. But then in 2009, that number has reduced to 9%. So that would suggest improvement. But it's interesting. We talk a lot about President Obama being the first black president. I have never heard someone say, well, when are we going to get that first AAPI president? Right? I mean, what if you're an AAPI and you're growing up, right? in the schoolhouse and the teacher's like, one day, Jimmy, you could be the president. You never really think about that or hear it. And so I think political leadership, NPR has done numerous stories now talking about how AAPI population has continued to become more politicized and run for mayoral elections. And that's great, and it is true, and it's documented, but there still remains a need. There still remains a need. All right. I'm sorry, this first part of today's talk might seem like a lecture. Now we'll get a little more engaging. So I apologize. We had to get that boring stuff out of the way. But, well, what is the stereotype of the model minority? Well, if you haven't caught it yet, it means, right, the suggestion that Asians are problem-free, they're successful, etc. The myth homogenizes a group that I already stated is the fastest growing racial and ethnic group and also represents a vast array of subpopulations. Right? So when we push all of these groups together, we suggest one reality, and that reality is success. But the truth of the matter is that the population of the AAPI is bimodal, which means there's two modes. We tend to look at the high end. We see wealthy Asians, we see high-achieving Asians, we see Amy Chua Asians, Tiger Mom parents, but we fail to see this lower end. And partially the reason is because we do live in segregated communities. I don't envision a great many of you live in segregated Chinatowns, but if you did, I'm sure you would come across poor immigrants. And so there's a myriad of reasons and explanations for why we buy into the myth. I'm just simply pointing out in this story that we can't homogenize. And I think of it as, I think a lot about food, so I think of peanut butter, right? That it's crunchy peanut butter, but we can't make it smooth. And that it's not all one, it's very different. These subgroups, right, show levels of educational attainment, and there's differences, as you can see. So that bikini, if you will, go back to that metaphor, conceals these differences because it covers it up, right? It also distorts gender and nativity effects. Nativity effects are where you're born. Are you foreign born or U.S. born? Are you a boy or are you a girl? And you can see differences. When we put all of Asians together, all of AAPIs together, we miss out on that variation. And that variation is what I would say makes America strong. The bikini suggests superior spellers. I was in the residence rooms prior to coming here, and I was watching ESPN, and they said, coming up tomorrow, I think, is the National Spelling Bee, Scripps National Spelling Bee. And see, so there's actually South Asian spelling bees. If you go online, you can see this. But there is a stereotype that Indian kids spell well, right? It also, the stereotype suggests that they're all nerdy. Now, someone said they saw a YouTube video of me and the whole crowd was going crazy laughing. Well, this is why they were laughing, because I said that was me. Well, I would be laughing too, because actually, as a little child, I did look like that. I mean, I have a first grade picture and I look just like that boy. But, right, the media tells us and informs and shapes our perception of Asian Pacific Islanders. Right? Christy Yamaguchi, and that even the American dream implies, right, that she's successful. But a few things you need to know, that she was born in the United States, right? And so we have to understand how the media can affect our thinking if we don't think critically. Now here is something that the bikini overlooks. It overlooks discrimination. Now, be honest with me. Raise your hand if you enjoy Starbucks, even though it's expensive, right? I think a lot of us do. And if you don't, if you're not raising your hand, you're lying. But at any rate, right? Beyond double cupping, they double cup and all that, and right, good coffee. But think about it. There have been Asians Korean Americans specifically who have gone into Starbucks, and this is what their cups come back with, chinky eyes. Now, if I went into a Starbucks, I came back and it was slanted eyes, I would be offended. I would go talk to the manager, right? But this is kind of an example that the stereotype, that bikini doesn't reveal. The bikini doesn't reveal this. It's small here, but on the bottom where it says name, it says lady, chinky eyes. Again, here's a Papa John's. Person, is it New York? In New York, ordered a pizza, and it said chinky eyes on there, you know. And so here's another example of racism that's overlooked. We've already talked about educational attainment being concealed. What about earning power? So we already said that there's a need for more Asian AAPI teachers, K-12 teachers, faculty in higher ed, also in the business sector, CEOs and all of that, even perhaps, I'm not sure the demographics at FDIC, but even maybe here at FDIC. Look at the return on investment, right, for the degree. In America, arguably, the more credentials you have and the higher credential you have, the more money you receive. But you see the differences by gender and race. I want to be that purple 121,000. You know, no one would say, "Hey, I want to be the black line who's only making 80 or 77 grand with a PhD or a JD or whatever credentials you have." And then even at the lower end, when I was in the hotel room, I saw a recent article that actually just did research, and they found that at that lower end, it's even more wider. It's wider, so that if you don't have an education, the gap is disparate. The bikini also conceals Asian objectification. This screen popped up when I was making the FDIC. Google, you know, when you use Google and you're typing and I'm doing research on this just popped up. I guess my browser didn't block it, but I thought, wow, like analytics or Amazon, you know, when you buy books and they give you, I was like, why? I must have been Googling Asian. This came up and I thought, wow, if I was an Asian girl, I wouldn't like that, right? I have 3 young daughters who are biracial, and when they're older, I don't want them to be thinking about themselves in that way. Or in the case of Elliot Roger, right? He's a biracial Asian, but he had a vendetta against Asians. The Santa Barbara murderer, if you haven't seen that case. So the bikini hides a lot of this ugliness, right? Or what about this? Here's a guy, this is in the UK, he gets a tattoo. Before I share this story, do any of you feel, I mean, we can laugh about it, but be honest, do any of you, though, have Asian art in your home, maybe like characters on the wall? Sometimes at Target I've seen them, or feng shui or different bamboo things. Do you have any Oriental art in your room or your house? Okay. So that's kind of, that could be commodification, but think of it this way. Think about people who get tattoos of Asian language and they don't even know how to read it. Would you ever go to a tattoo parlor and get a tattoo emblazoned on your shoulder and not know what it says? Well, this boy did. This boy did. Right? Now, glad there's corrective laser surgery to get rid of the ink. Right? Now, have you seen this? And be honest with me. I'm going to show the slide. Raise your hand if you've seen this, okay? You ready? Yeah. All right. No. Have you? No. No one? I haven't either. I think we'd be in the world would be a crazy place if it was like this, right? We don't. Now, let me ask just a rhetorical question. Why is that? Why don't we see things like that? Well, because it's ludicrous. It's insanity. And I think we need to question, right, what we can constitute art. And certainly...
I actually have seen it once.
You have?
And it was
on her butt? Oh, man. Oh. Yeah. You do, yeah. Well, let's save that for a Q&A because I have something to tell you. Okay. Now here's a picture. This is not me, but again, looks like me back in the day. I mentioned I was a transracial adoptee. But I laughed when I saw this picture, and that's why I saved it. And I want to share a few thoughts about the model minority and the need for this understanding for Asian American adoptees. Right? So when I think about my K-12 experience, some would say, one of my students, my graduate student said, well, Dr. Hartlep, you know what? You're talking about a stereotype, and you're like, you're an embodiment of it. I'm like, how am I an embodiment of it, student, whatever? It's like, well, because you have a doctorate and you're going to give a lecture. Isn't that success? I said, well, let's back up a moment. Did I go to Harvard? No. Did school come easy for me? No. How did my K-12 experience go? Well, I tell them, right, I experienced poor grades. I actually was told, right, that you're probably not college material. Now, that was at the bachelor's level. Intense bullying, right? This is me personally. If you look at the literature and statistics, AAPI students report the highest rates of classroom bullying. Highest. Now, there's many explanations for that. One is we tend to be smaller stature. Now, I gained considerable amount of weight in the past 5 years. But as a youngster, I was super small, right? And arguably not very strong, so people teased me and picked on me, right? And so there's many explanations why. That doesn't mean it's right, but right, pushing back at, I don't think I'm a model minority, and certainly I wasn't a model minority because, right, being raised in a white household, right? One of the arguments is, oh, these Chinese parents like Amy Chua, Tiger Moms, it's their culture that explains why they're so smart. They play violin and they just work hard and they go to Yale. And I'm thinking, well, my parents were working middle class, they were white, and they had no clue about college. One had a technical education degree and the other had a bachelor's degree, but they had no clue on education, how it works in this country. They weren't telling me to go to Harvard. They were telling me to go to some small state school, right? So certainly I don't believe that I'm a model minority. Okay, I want to share opportunities for AAPI population, right? 3 or 4 things that are on my heart, right? One is affirmative action. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for affirmative action. But what you have going on in states like California, you have this SCA, this Senate Congressional Amendment, Constitution Amendment, trying to reverse Proposition 209, right? So California is a colorblind state. They can't use race. And this SCA 5 would allow colleges to use race. But there are some Asian American groups who are saying, no, we want to stay colorblind. We want to stay in this meritocracy that we do well, right? And there's actually a term, they call it negative action. Negative action is this fancy word that implies that Asians are hurt by affirmative action, which is really not true. I'm concerned about the rising student loans debt. Now, did you know that student loan debt does not go away even through death? You can die and it does not discharge your debt. It follows your co-signers, it follows your next of kin. It will find someone and attach itself to it, right? You can't go bankrupt. That means, right, you cannot go bankrupt. You might go and buy a Lamborghini and go in debt on your credit card, file for bankruptcy, and that debt goes away. Student loan does not, right? And so there is data that suggests that Asians don't have that much of student debt, high rates of student debt. But it's not as simple as saying, okay, so it's not a problem. It might be a problem. It might, in fact, mean that Asians are not going to college as much as they could, and they're actually concentrated in 2-year colleges because they're afraid to take on student debt. So we need to unpack that. What about mental health and counseling services for Asians and other groups? Have you heard of this case? His name was Eldo Kim. He was a Korean guy who was at Harvard last fall. He had not studied so they say, and he was stressed for an exam. And so he fabricated a bomb threat. He thought, you know what, I'm just going to make a fake email, send it to Harvard, and say there's bombs in the building where I'm going to take my exam in about 20 minutes. I'll get off the hook, right? Well, he got off the hook all right, and then he got back on the hook, and now he's facing, right, criminal charges, right? But the undue pressure of the stereotype. There are some kids, some AAPIs who buy into this, and then they commit suicide when they aren't successful. Right, so we need to unpack mental health and counseling services. I already talked about the subgroups. What about multiracial Asians or adopted Asians? So this Elliot Roger, one of his parents was Chinese. So he clearly had mental issues going on, but he also had probably identity issues. So counseling would have perhaps helped him about his racial identity. What about political representation? Again, I told you about, I hear we have the first black president. I don't hear the first Asian president, right? And lastly, this last bullet point of complicity. What complicity means for me is this idea that there are Asian American Pacific Islanders who are intentionally perpetuating this myth. What do I mean by that? Well, they benefit from the myth. Amy Chua is one person, right, who writes books on, has anyone read her new book, The Triple Package? About how some groups, immigrant groups, and some Mormons, Asians, other groups are doing really well in America, right? They benefit from buying into this. And the one thing that I really encourage people to do is whenever you think about this, think about it through a lens of class, meaning, who are you really talking about? Are you talking about wealthy Asians, or are you talking about poor Asians, right? So there has to always be an element of looking at things through money, because money is a great divider. It separates us, right? There are wealthy black people, and there are poor black people. There are wealthy Asian people, and there are poor Asian people. There are wealthy white people and poor. So there's always, it's important to have a class analysis to it. And that's something that Bradley Porfirio and I write about in this book that's coming out. We call it Killing the Model Minority Stereotype, Asian American Complicity and Counter Stories, pushing back. If you look in the back, again, this is props to Tack again. He created this artwork, book cover. Behind the Bruce Lee fighter, you see all of these different stereotypes, right? You have the railroad worker on the Transcontinental Railroad, the coolie labor. You have the violinist. You have, this angry Asian guy. You have the nerd, and you have the lotus blossom, right? And so these are things. Now, this last slide, there's a story behind it. My college students, and also I heard high school students continually and repetitiously telling me swag. Has anyone heard of that term? Like, oh, you got swag. And I thought, I'm like, what on earth does this mean? I mean, I'm young, but I never heard that term. So I looked it up. And so now, this shirt is on its way to me. Compliments of Amazon. But I think the acronym should stand for something we Asians got. So I don't know what it truly means, but I'm kind of turning it into this, something we Asians got. So thank you for your attention.
Question, for the endowed professor statistics that you put up, was that just for the U.S. or worldwide?
That was for the U.S. Let me back it up so you can see here. Yes, so that's professors who are currently professors in the U.S. and who teach in colleges of education and or specifically education courses. Now, this study was published in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, so you can see it there, the full-fledged article, but yeah, to answer your question, it was U.S.
Thank you, Dr. Hartlep. Actually, I have two questions. I'm just going to ask one of them. But your statistic on the thought shift, people in 2000 imagining an AAPI president versus people in, I think, 2010 or so, how much of that do you think is in relation to the demographic shift in population to younger and people of color becoming more numerous in the population?
Yeah, I think it's a component of it. So in academic parlance, I'm a critical theorist. And so you're a lawyer, previous lawyer, so much of critical race theory is steeped in critical legal studies. And so my thought is there is a shift, and I'm noticing organizations latching onto the shift. And for instance, marketing, Walmart, Kmart, all of these stores are understanding that there's a large market share of Asian Pacific Islanders out there, that they represent money, and that they don't want to lose out. And so I definitely think that the attitudes could be a byproduct of the demographic shift. Also, I see that people that aren't seeing that are going to kind of fall by the wayside. Companies, certainly the private sector. But then from a critical analysis point of view, I think there are ulterior motives. Meaning, when you think about, and I know it's not Asian, but Brown versus Board of Education when schools were integrated in the 50s, right? Actually, since Brown, schools are more segregated than when supposedly they became desegregated. So it doesn't make sense unless you have that critical lens. And so I think that something fishy is going on in terms of that. I think the attitudes are always still there. I think prejudice is still there. But there is research that really talks about implicit biases, right? You hear of you see someone and a woman clutches her purse just subconsciously. I think the attitude and prejudice towards Asians is there. But I'm hopeful that we'll become more multicultural and have more representation of Asians as the shift goes on.
Any additional questions?
Okay.
I was waiting for your question.
So are a lot of people. Thank you so much for joining us and for your presentation. When you presented the slide about basically poverty among AAPIs, one of the things that I was thinking on and that I continue to think about through the rest of your presentation was how I very much admire it when the media shows us what poverty right at our doorsteps, right next door, that we're not looking at really looks like. Recent movie, Beasts of the Southern Wild. And just, as you were speaking, I could just, through my head, I could name so many different excellent TV shows or movies that have shown me what poverty looks like from particular groups or in particular areas, and I can't think of any that show what AAPI poverty that you were showing in that slide looks like. Can you give me some illustrations?
Yeah, I can give you a great one. It's not I think when we say movies, that's a broad spectrum, but in terms of documentary films you might want to think about looking at is one's called Village of Versailles, and it looks at the Vietnamese population in Louisiana, in New Orleans. Prior to Katrina and post-Katrina. And what you find is, right, that outside of Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, that it has the largest per capita of Vietnamese, that there's a huge concentration, right? And I remember a few years back, we were in New Orleans at a conference, And I told my black friends and my white friends, I said, you know, I don't see any Vietnamese people around here. And they look at me and they're like, this is New Orleans. This is Mardi Gras and all this. Why, there's not Vietnamese. I said, yes, there is. You know, and I'm a pretty stubborn person, and they didn't believe me. So that really irked me. So, you know, looking at telling them this. But if you look at that movie, it kind of shares the injustice, right? That when all of the storm devastated everything, what they had to do was pick up all of the garbage, right? And toxic garbage, right? Paints and all these dangerous chemicals. And they essentially said, well, let's relocate it to Versailles. And Versailles is the community in which the Vietnamese live. And they said, wait a minute, you cannot put all this toxic stuff here. We have a school. You know, they fish, right? They're fishing. That's a large part of their economy is fishing, and that's going to contaminate fish. You know, leach into the waters and all that. So they had kind of an uprising, and they fought back, and they won. That they had to relocate it. But that's the only one that really speaks to me of hardship, because you're absolutely right. There is a limited amount of stories or media coverage of poverty, like you're suggesting. But I would recommend that movie. I think you can even find it on YouTube. Yep, Village of Versailles. I don't know how to spell Versailles. It's fancy.
I do want to ask my other question, because it really, like Peter was saying, the thought of Asian poverty kind of stuck with him. What stuck with me was the mythology that you're fighting against, the mythology that Asians have it so good, they're so smart, they're so successful. I'm thinking in juxtaposition, the mythology that black people had to rebut was drugs and crime. You know, so when you watch the evening news and there were, you know, statistics given about crime, you know, you'd always kind of see the ghetto, the black area and all this. But, you know, we all know statistically we're a minority in terms of crime.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, and drugs and so forth. And I was thinking about how difficult it was from my perspective to overcome that. Can you talk a little bit more about the difficulty? Because you already suggested that even within the Asian community, there's pushback in trying to rebut some of that mythology.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the myth was created in the U.S. in 1966. A Berkeley sociologist by the name of William Peterson wrote an article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine, and it applauded Japanese Americans for being successful. To answer your question, the mythology that the African American community has had to face and battle against is actually the precursor to this mythology. What do I mean by that? When Peterson wrote his piece in '66, that was a year after a report was published in '65 by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Secretary of Labor. And in the Moynihan report, he talked about black ghetto culture and the crumbling of America due to a culture of poverty. So you have to understand that stories are told in relation to other stories. So if you have a pre-story that says, look at you black people, you're doing bad things, this is why, your culture is bad. And then you tell another story of, look at you Japanese, your culture is good, you're law-abiding, you're different than this population. What you get is, right, a story off another story. And so the mythology that Asians have had to face, actually, Asians aren't the first model minorities. Jews were in the United States, right? And then we know all of stereotypes about Jews, that they're, frugal and all of that. Well, the flip side of the stereotype of Asians are that, what happens if Asians become too successful? Then they're a threat. Right? So the model minority stereotype is told in juxtaposition, to use your words, to the yellow peril. And the yellow peril was in the 1800s when, right, we excluded Chinese from immigrating into America, right, when we had these bachelor societies, because they must have been good enough to make our railroads, but not good enough to be part of citizens, right? And so that's the irony. The irony is that there isn't consensus within the AAPI community. Some people, you look, they write amicus briefs. If you're not sure what amicus briefs are, amicus brief is a brief of support. Some are filing amicus briefs in support, and others are in opposition. So there isn't really a consensus, which I think is damaging. But that's a great question. And in terms of the mythology, right? Moral philosophy talks about like why are stereotypes bad? Many people say, well, Dr. Hartlep, wouldn't you want a positive stereotype rather than a negative stereotype? And I rebuff and I say, well, not if my positive stereotype is predicated on a nasty stereotype of other people. Do you follow my train of thought? So it just does not make sense. It just does not make sense.
Any additional questions? Okay, Leslie, you're on.
Oh, one more.
Oh, one more question.
Great presentation, Professor. In it, you mentioned that the AAPI caucus has revealed a bunch of obstacles in a couple realms of leadership. Can you mention in your research if you found any coalition building with the AAPI caucus with other minority leadership groups?
Yeah, so coalition building is something that's really sexy right now in terms of people talking a lot about. But again, when we think of the AAPI Heritage Month compared to Black Heritage Month, for instance, we are relatively infantile. We're new. We haven't had a Heritage Month for as long as other groups, right? So when you think about that, civil rights struggles for AAPIs are very similar to the Black population. What do I mean by that? Well, civil rights, SNCC and other groups who were having sit-ins, right, in Greensboro and in Alabama, when they were doing coalition building with whites, what happened? Well, the white-black coalition slowly went away. And what it became was more militant and more nationalistic, right? That it went this way. And so I think with the AAPI, there is coalition building, and it is present. There isn't evidence to suggest it will go away. But in the literature about AAPIs, no, I haven't seen coalitions other than AAPI coalitions. What do I mean that? There's Japanese coalitions working with Chinese and Koreans working. So it's kind of like that cross-pollination, but it's not like whites per se working with Asians per se. I probably didn't answer your question. I apologize.
It was a great lecture, Professor. Also, I would like to know if you have any information on biracial AAPI people and how they fare in today's economy and so forth.
Yeah, so in the book that I said that will be coming out soon, there's an author, her name is Mary Beth Gassman. She's a professor at University of Pennsylvania. She authored a chapter talking exactly what you're saying. And her research area is in historically Black colleges and universities. And she makes the argument in her chapter that there is a need to support AAPIs that are biracial or multiracial, or HAPA as they're called. So the government has AANIPISI, AANIPISI, institutions that serve large percentages of Asians. They have this federal designation. They're a minority serving institution, right? And so Mary Beth, Dr. Gassman and her students wrote a chapter talking about that there isn't really programs in colleges that support the needs of these populations. So this is kind of early. Not a lot of people have been writing about it, but there certainly is a need. And again, I think that need is becoming more realized as this demographic shift is occurring. There's no running away from it. Asians are here to stay, and there's no evidence to suggest they're going away anytime soon, right? This population growth and increase. So there is research being done on this for multiracial, and and the argument too, bottom line is, are Asians people of color? I mean, that's kind of a fundamental question. Some people would say no, they would reject that. Others would say, clearly they're minorities. I benefited from affirmative action, but if I were in another state at another university, I perhaps might not have been eligible to receive financial support. So, great question. Thank you for asking it.
We have another round of applause for Dr. Hartlep. Thank you very much. Doctor, on behalf of the FDIC, I want to thank you sincerely for coming here and sharing your thoughts and your ideas and part of your own life, and actually even opening a few doors, I think, for some of us and to consider things about AAPI culture that we hadn't been thinking about before. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for attending. Our next Diversity and Inclusion Education Series event will be for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Pride Month. That's going to be right here in the Hove Auditorium on June 12th at 2 p.m. There are refreshments outside. Thank you very much for coming. Have a good afternoon.